Everyone quotes Sun Tzu, the gym motivation reel, the boardroom slide deck, the guy at the party who read 50 pages and now references it in every conversation like a personality trait. All warfare is deception, said with confidence, said like it means something, said by someone who has no idea what Sun Tzu was actually describing. Here is what those people missed. Sun Tzu was not giving you permission to be sneaky. He was not writing a manual for salespeople or a self-help framework for morning routines. He was describing something colder and more precise than any of that. Or at least, that is the most defensible reading of what the text actually does when you read it in full rather than in fragments. Why some individuals walk into a room and everything subtly shifts toward them without a single word being spoken. Why some conflicts end before the first move is made. Why certain people seem to win at a level that others cannot even observe, let alone compete with. The Art of War is 13 chapters. Most people have encountered 2 sentences of it, usually misquoted, almost always stripped of the context that makes them mean anything. The actual text, the full system Sun Tzu built across those chapters, describes 8 distinct principles of psychological dominance that have nothing to do with armies and everything to do with the way human beings process threat, uncertainty, and power. This video is not a summary of the art of war. Those exist. You don't need another one. This is an excavation of what Sun Tzu was actually building, the psychological engine beneath the military language. 8 laws, each one describing a way of operating that most people will never access, not because it is complicated, but because it requires a fundamental shift in where you aim your attention. Most people aim at what is happening. Sun Tzu aimed at what made it happen. That distinction is everything. And by the end of this, you will see it operating around you constantly. In the people who hold power quietly, in the conflicts you have lost without understanding why, and in the ones you won without knowing how. Before the laws, the person, or the idea of the person. Because this is where it gets interesting, and most people skip it entirely. The historical record on Sun Tzu is genuinely contested. Most scholars place him in the late spring and autumn period of ancient China, roughly the 5th century BC, though some date the text later to the Warring States period. The distinction matters because the context shapes the content. The spring and autumn period was an era of collapsing central authority. The Zhou dynasty's grip was weakening. Dozens of rival states competed for dominance, and survival for any ruler required something more sophisticated than raw military force. Brute strength was available to everyone. Strategic intelligence was rare. Sun Tzu is traditionally identified as a military general who served King Heilu of the state of Wu. The most famous account of him comes from Sima Qian's Records of the Grand Historian, written in the 1st century BC, roughly 300 to 400 years after Sun Tzu supposedly lived. According to Sima Qian, the king tested Sun Tzu's methods by asking him to train his palace concubines as soldiers. Sun Tzu divided them into 2 companies and appointed 2 of the king's favorites as commanders. When he gave commands and they laughed, he warned them that unclear orders are the general's fault. When they laughed again, after the orders were repeated clearly, he had the 2 commanders executed. New commanders were appointed. The remaining women performed every drill without error. Historians still debate whether this story reflects historical reality or is a later embellishment designed to illustrate the text's principles dramatically. What is not debated is the text itself. The Art of War exists. Its 13 chapters have been studied, copied, and applied by Chinese military commanders for over 2 millennia. During the Song dynasty, it was included in the 7 military classics, the official canon of Chinese military knowledge. Mao Zedong drew on it explicitly in his writings on guerrilla warfare. A French translation by Jesuit missionary Joseph Amiot appeared in 1772, meaning Napoleon could have encountered it. He was active militarily from the 1790s onward, but no direct evidence of his reading it has been confirmed, and the structural similarities some military historians observe between his campaigns and Sun Tzu's framework may reflect convergent strategic thinking rather than direct influence. There is also the figure of Sun Bin, traditionally described as a descendant of Sun Wu, though scholars note the claim cannot be verified and may be a later attribution. Sun Bin wrote his own military treatise in the following century, rediscovered on bamboo slips in 1972. Some scholars have gone further, arguing that what we call Sun Tzu may be a composite tradition, ideas developed across generations and possibly two distinct figures, both referred to as Master Sun in classical Chinese texts, whose work was eventually consolidated under one name. This possibility does not diminish the work. It clarifies something important about it. These principles were not theoretical constructs. They were tested in conditions where miscalculation meant death, not embarrassment, not failure, death, and refined accordingly. Whatever the precise origin of the text, it carries the weight of consequence in every line. That weight is what makes it worth your time. What follows is not philosophy for its own sake. It is a system that survived because it worked. The most important idea in the art of war is also the most consistently misread. In Chapter 4, Sun Tzu writes that the skilled commander first places himself in a position where defeat is impossible, then waits for the enemy to create an opportunity for their own defeat. He is not describing battlefield tactics. He is describing a principle of positioning, the idea that the outcome of any conflict is determined not during the engagement, but before it begins. By the time two forces meet, the result is already decided. Everything that follows is merely confirmation. Think about what this means in practice. Most people enter conflict reactively. Something happens, a challenge, an insult, a competitive threat, and they respond to it. The conflict is already underway by the time they engage. They are operating on ground chosen by someone else, at a timing chosen by someone else, with emotional activation that has already compromised their judgment. They are not winning a fight. They are managing a situation they did not design. This is the failure Sun Tzu is describing. Not losing the fight. Being in the fight at all, on those terms. The cognitive science underneath this is precise. When someone feels attacked, threatened, or cornered, cortisol rises and the amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, takes over processing. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for strategic reasoning and long-term thinking, yields. The person becomes reactive. Whoever triggered that state is now controlling the engagement, not through any overt power, but through the mechanism of the other person's own nervous system. The person who has already won does not allow that state to be triggered in themselves. More importantly, they have already shaped the conditions of engagement before anyone else realized conditions were being shaped. They chose the ground, they chose the timing, they chose the framing. By the time anyone else arrives, every visible option favors the person who was there first. This requires a different relationship with time than most people have. Most people are focused on what is happening now. Sun Tzu's first law demands focus on what is being prepared for 6 months from now. What alliances are forming, what resources are being positioned, what ground is being occupied quietly before anyone thinks to contest it. Drop this in the comments if this already describes someone in your life. They never seem to be reacting. They are always already somewhere you didn't expect. Law 2 deepens the first. Chapter 6 describes what Sun Tzu calls Zhu and Shi, the empty and the full. The principle: a skilled commander does not attack where the enemy is concentrated and prepared. They attack where the enemy is absent, undefended, and unaware, and they reveal as little as possible about where that attack is coming, so that the enemy must spread their defensive resources everywhere at once, which means they are strong nowhere. The translation into everyday life is direct and uncomfortable. Most people telegraph themselves constantly. They signal what they want through their behavior. They reveal what they fear through their emotional reactions. They let their plans become visible through the pattern of their choices. This feels natural. It even feels like integrity. Being open about your intentions, being readable, being authentic. In close personal relationships with people who have earned that trust, it may well be. In competitive environments, professional hierarchies, negotiations, social dynamics where interests do not fully align, it is a strategic liability. When the people around you know what you want, they know what leverage they have over you. When they know what you fear losing, they know how to threaten you. When they can see where you are building, they can position against it before you arrive. Sun Tzu's principle is not deception in the crude sense. It is strategic withholding. You present enough to engage people, enough to seem accessible, collaborative, open. But the actual direction of your effort, the real destination of your work, remains unclear until the position is already secured. By the time anyone understands what happened, it has already happened. The psychological mechanism that makes this so effective is the brain's compulsive need for narrative completion. When people have partial information about someone, they do not register the gap as uncertainty. They fill it. The brain constructs a story about who you are and what you're doing based on what you have chosen to show. If what you have shown is carefully selected, the story they construct will be the story you wanted them to believe. Not because you lied to them, because you understood how perception works and used it deliberately. Chapter 3 contains Sun Tzu's most radical claim: the supreme form of skill is to subdue the enemy without fighting. Below that, disrupt their alliances before they solidify. Below that, attack their forces in the field. The lowest form of strategy is to besiege a fortified city. Most people read this hierarchy and interpret it as a preference for cleverness over confrontation. That is too shallow. The hierarchy is about cost accounting. Every direct confrontation, even one you win decisively, costs you. It costs energy and resources you will not recover. It reveals your methods to everyone watching. It creates adversaries who had no stake before the fight began. People who were neutral and are now aligned against you because of how you engaged. And critically, it locks you into a visible position. Now everyone knows you will fight, knows how you fight, and can prepare accordingly. The person who understands the full cost of winning avoids victory through confrontation, not because they lack the capability, but because they have done the accounting and found it too expensive. They pursue something cheaper and more permanent. The deeper move is this: most people will eventually destroy their own position. Impatience, overconfidence, emotional volatility, the inability to accurately read a room. These tendencies do not disappear under pressure. They intensify. A person who is already prone to overcommitting will overcommit catastrophically when they feel threatened. A person who deflects accountability will become more rigid and isolated precisely when flexibility and collaboration would save them. The flaws accelerate. What is required is patience, the specific patience of not interfering. When you resist the urge to engage, to respond, to escalate, You deny the other person the reaction they are seeking. This matters because most aggressive moves are designed to provoke a response. The response justifies the next move. When you refuse to provide it, the aggressor must either escalate without justification, which costs them social credibility, or de-escalate, which costs them momentum. Either way, you have not lost anything. They have. This is the principle behavioral economists Kahneman and Tversky identified as loss aversion. People make systematically worse decisions under the threat of losing something than under the prospect of gaining something equivalent. Someone who feels their position is eroding will take risks they would otherwise consider irrational. They will move early, commit to positions before they're ready, overextend. You do not need to create this situation. You only need to recognize it when it is already forming. And wait. Law 4 addresses the most persistent illusion in how people think about influence. Most people, when they want to change someone's behavior, address the person directly. They make requests, arguments, demands. Sometimes this works. More often it triggers resistance, the psychological phenomenon of reactance, in which people push back against perceived attempts to control them, not because they disagree with the direction, but because the attempt itself feels like a constraint on their autonomy. Sun Tzu understood that trying to control a person is inefficient. The alternative is environmental control. You do not tell people what to do. You design the conditions within which they make choices, so that the available options naturally lead where you need them to go. The person believes they are choosing freely. They are. The options they are choosing between were curated. This is how an agenda shapes a meeting before a word is spoken. It is how access to information shapes decisions before the decision-maker is even aware a decision is being made. It is how framing a question a certain way determines the range of acceptable answers. The person who designs the context holds more leverage than the person who controls any single individual within it, because the context shapes everyone simultaneously and requires no continuous effort to maintain. Chapter 6 makes this explicit. Force the enemy to come to you rather than going to the enemy. The person who controls the ground chooses the conditions. Everyone else is operating within a structure they did not design, often without recognizing that a structure exists at all. If you've ever walked away from a conversation thinking you made a decision freely, and later realized that every option you were considering had been placed in front of you by someone else, you have experienced this law from the wrong side of it. Chapter 6 contains what is probably Sun Tzu's most quoted image, water, and almost no one applies it correctly. The passage sits at the end of his treatment of empty and full, Xu and Shy, as though it is the conclusion the whole chapter was building toward. Water has no constant form. The line is usually interpreted as an encouragement toward flexibility, toward not being rigid. That reading is too comfortable. It misses the mechanism. Sun Tzu uses water not because water is gentle or accommodating. He uses water because water is, over time, unstoppable, precisely because it does not insist on a single direction. Water finds the lowest point. It moves around obstacles without announcing itself. It enters through cracks so small they are invisible. It does not declare war on the rock. It simply persists in its nature until the rock is gone. The psychological translation, rigidity is not strength. It is the appearance of strength covering a fundamental fragility. People who maintain a single, consistent face, who cannot adjust their strategy without feeling that they have compromised something, are brittle. When conditions change, and conditions always change, they face a choice between adapting and appearing inconsistent, or staying fixed and becoming irrelevant. Most people, terrified of looking weak or indecisive, stay fixed. They lose. The person who can change form without losing substance, who can present differently in different contexts, adjust their approach without drama, abandon a strategy the moment evidence indicates it is not working, is almost impossible to counter. You cannot design a defense against a target that will not hold still. You cannot outmaneuver someone who has already considered every position on the board and holds none of them with attachment. This requires a particular psychological security that is rarer than it sounds. The fear beneath rigidity is the fear of being caught wrong, of having to admit that the situation has changed, which implies that your previous read of the situation was incomplete. Most people cannot do this without experiencing it as a form of defeat. So they double down, they commit harder to the position that is failing them. They interpret persistence as virtue when it has become obstruction. The person who has internalized Law 5 does not experience changing course as defeat. They experience it as accuracy. Updating to match reality is not weakness. It is the only rational response to new information, and the ability to do it without psychological cost, without ego interference, is itself a form of power that most people will never develop. Write this down somewhere you'll return to it. The person who is attached to being right will always eventually lose to the person who is attached to being accurate. Chapter 2 of The Art of War opens not with strategy or philosophy, but with a precise extended accounting of what warfare costs: chariots, horses, armor, supplies, transportation, the economic burden on civilian populations, the degradation of equipment over months in the field. Sun Tzu catalogues all of it. Then he makes the point that a general who does not understand what a campaign costs before it begins does not understand the campaign. This is Law 6, and it operates far beyond military planning. Most people enter processes, commitments, conflicts, relationships, projects, with an optimistic calculation. They focus on what they want to gain. They sketch a rough timeline, assume things will proceed reasonably, and begin. The cost accounting is incomplete or absent. When the real costs start appearing, the time, the energy, the relationships strained by the focus this requires, the opportunities not taken because this one was, two things tend to happen. Either the person abandons the commitment, wasting everything already invested, or they fall into the sunk cost fallacy, continuing past the rational point of return because they cannot psychologically accept that what they already spent is gone, regardless of what they do next. They are no longer pursuing the goal. They are trying to retroactively justify the cost. Sun Tzu's discipline is brutal in its clarity. Calculate the full cost before the first step. Not the hoped-for cost. Not the cost if everything goes well. The realistic cost, including the failure states. If the honest accounting makes the objective not worth pursuing, do not begin. Abandon the idea completely, without attachment, without loss of face, because nothing has been invested yet. If the cost is acceptable, then the second part of the principle applies with equal force. Commit completely. A halfway engagement is almost as expensive as a full one and produces a fraction of the return. The person who begins something already hedging their commitment has spent the cost of starting without accessing the full potential of finishing. The people around you who seem to move with unusual decisiveness, who begin things cleanly and finish them, who do not get trapped in half-completed commitments, are often not more courageous than others. They are more precise in their pre-commitment accounting. They know the price before they agree to pay it. Chapter 11, the longest and arguably most psychologically dense chapter in the text, deals with what Sun Tzu calls the 9 terrains, but embedded within it is something that reads less like tactical geography and more like a theory of command psychology. Reading across these passages, what emerges is a picture of the kind of leader Sun Tzu considered most effective, one whose influence has been so thoroughly built into the structure around them that their moment-to-moment presence becomes almost secondary. The highest quality of command, as Sun Tzu's language in this chapter implies, is when the structure operates without constant visible direction. The text is not explicit in naming this as a standalone principle. What emerges is more an inference from how Sun Tzu describes the ideal relationship between a general and their forces. When the training is thorough enough, the principles clear enough, the alignment deep enough, that the general's moment-to-moment presence becomes almost irrelevant. The troops execute because they understand what they are trying to achieve and why, not because someone is watching. The general who must be present for everything, who must issue constant instructions, whose presence is required for any significant decision, has not built leadership. They have built dependency. They have made themselves indispensable through a failure, the failure to create something that functions in their absence. Everything they have built will stop when they stop. That is not power. That is a very expensive personal operation. Sun Tzu's ideal is the general who has largely disappeared from the visible running of things, whose influence is everywhere present but nowhere obvious, whose decisions have already been made in the form of principles and structures that others now execute as their own judgment. When things go well, the structure gets credit. When things go wrong, the structure reveals a gap that needs addressing. The general learns from both without ego interference. The psychological effect of this on everyone around them is significant. When someone consistently produces results without appearing to expend effort, when their authority seems to operate at a distance without enforcement, they become difficult to read. Their power becomes abstract. Abstract power creates more deference than visible power, because you cannot position against something you cannot locate. You cannot challenge authority that does not present a face to challenge. This is also, practically, the only form of influence that scales. Personal presence has a ceiling. A structure does not. Sun Tzu's final and deepest principle is where all the others converge. In Chapter 3, he establishes the hierarchy of strategic targets. The highest skill attacks the enemy's strategy. Below that, disrupt their alliances. Below that, engage their forces. The lowest form is to besiege their cities. The hierarchy points to something precise about where conflicts actually originate. Wars do not begin in armies. They begin in decisions. Decisions come from assessments of what is possible. Those assessments come from beliefs, and beliefs exist in the realm of psychology. In the story, an individual or organization tells itself about what it can achieve, what threatens it, and what it is willing to risk. Attack the story. Everything downstream will follow. Sun Tzu was writing about armies, but the psychological logic he describes maps cleanly onto how belief shapes behavior at every scale. An army that believes it cannot win does not fight well, regardless of its material capabilities. The historical record is full of numerically superior forces defeated by opponents who had somehow made them believe the outcome before the engagement. A person who believes they are already losing makes decisions that confirm that belief, retreating from positions they could hold, conceding terms they could contest, signaling weakness that invites further pressure. The psychological state generates the material reality, almost always. This is why the most effective moves in any serious conflict tend to be symbolic or informational before they are material. You do not neutralize a competitor by taking their resources first. You neutralize them by demonstrating, clearly and publicly, that you already occupy ground they believed they were competing for, before they have committed to the campaign to take it. When they see that demonstration, they revise their assessment of what is possible. That revision is the victory. Everything else is administration. This principle operates at every scale, in every context. In a negotiation, the person who arrives, having already demonstrated their alternatives, has shifted the psychological terrain before a word is spoken. In a professional environment, the person whose reputation for producing results precedes them never has to establish credibility in the room. It arrived before they did. The body of the conflict, the argument, the competition, the formal contest, follows the spirit. Win the spirit, and the body tends to follow without needing to be forced. If you can identify one conflict in your life right now where you are fighting at the surface level, arguing, competing, pushing, ask yourself what belief is actually driving the dynamic. What does the other person think is possible? What do they believe about you? What do they believe about their own position? Change what they believe, and the surface conflict resolves itself. 8 laws, one mechanism underneath all of them. Most people engage with the world at the level of what is visible. The argument that is currently happening, the obstacle in front of them today, the position being contested right now. Sun Tzu's entire system is built on one core insight. By the time something is visible, it was decided somewhere else. The fight you are watching is not the fight that mattered. The fight that mattered happened earlier, in the positioning, in the psychological state that preceded the event, in the structure that determined what options were even available. The person who operates at that invisible level is not playing the same game as everyone around them. They are shaping conditions before they materialize, attacking strategies before armies form, building structures that outlast their presence, changing what is believed before, contesting what is material. They are doing what Sun Tzu describes in Chapter 4, winning first and then going to fight. This cannot be adopted as a set of tactics. Tactics without the underlying perceptual shift are just manipulation, and manipulation is detectable and fragile. What Sun Tzu is describing is a way of seeing, a habitual attention to what is beneath the surface of events, to the forces that shaped what is in front of you, to what is being decided right now that will be visible 6 months from now. Develop that attention, apply it to something specific this week. Not all 8 laws at once. Pick the one that describes a gap you already sense in how you are operating. Sit with it until the mechanism is clear. Then use it, once precisely, and observe what happens. The most dangerous person in any environment is not the loudest, the most aggressive, or even the most intelligent. It is the person who understood the terrain before anyone else arrived. Sun Tzu built that person 2,500 years ago. The blueprint is still intact. If this changed how you see conflict and power, hit the like button. Subscribe and turn on notifications for more content on the psychology of how power actually moves. The battle you think you're in is almost never the one that matters. That's the first thing Sun Tzu wanted you to understand. And now you do.